My name is Matt Desmond. I'm an assistant professor of sociology and social studies at Harvard and also a junior fellow on the Harvard Society Fellows. And most of my work focuses on poverty and housing and eviction, mainly through an ethnographic perspective. So right now in the U.S., low-income families are facing the worst affordable housing crisis they've seen in about 70 years. We've had a flatlining of incomes, and then just a surge or an explosion of rent and housing costs. So in the 2000s in the Northeast, median asking rents have increased about 40% over the last 10 years. In the Midwest, they've increased about 21%. So at the same time, incomes have really flatlined, and housing policy and assistance has really failed to bridge the gap. And so what we've seen is just a huge spike of families that are devoting upwards of 50, 60, 70% of their income to rent. So if you look at the American Housing Survey, for example, for the first time in a long time, the majority of families living below the poverty line are dedicating over 70% of their income to housing costs, which means that to a lot of families, they're just living one really small misstep away from eviction. And eviction itself has become pretty commonplace in poor neighborhoods. So in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, the city that I study, in poor inner city neighborhoods, about 1 out of 14 households, renting households, are evicted every year, are forced out every year, which is an extremely high number of families moving into shelters and homelessness, and generally are just kind of experiencing increased residential instability. One lived reality is just extreme stress experienced when you're giving so much of your income to rent. And often tenants view that what they're giving as in relational terms. You know, you're giving 80%, 85% of your income. Landlords often see it in terms of the market, and so they think of it as a very low rent, and sometimes they don't invest in their properties. So you're a family, you're giving almost all you have to live in this really rundown house in a poor neighborhood. And I think that's extremely frustrating to a lot of families. And I think it also puts them on edge if an unexpected expense hits, like a funeral, death in the family, unexpected medical expense, things like that. And so sometimes families are often just kind of on the brink. For those families that do experience eviction, that can be manifest in a lot of different things. One is increased mobility for their kids and missing school or bouncing from school to school and place to place. Another is just kind of relocating to a worse neighborhood or worse housing conditions. So sometimes you'll see an eviction where a family moves from a 3-bedroom apartment in kind of a solid working class neighborhood. Something will happen, a job loss or some unexpected expense. That family often moves, say, to a 2-bedroom or a 1-bedroom apartment in a much worse neighborhood in the city. So I think it's manifest. You know, one of the effects of eviction too is felt where you end up. And then we're seeing long-term effects of eviction on all sorts of measures. Folks that get evicted 2-3 years later have higher depression, higher chances of depression. Their children have worse health. They have higher material hardship, which is kind of our measure of the lived experience of scarcity. So it seems that eviction in and of itself is not just a condition of poverty, a condition of this affordable housing crisis, but also a cause of insecurity. Great, so one of the points that's really important is the foreclosure crisis in America often is pitched as a crisis for homeowners. But a lot of folks that are losing their homes are landlords. And so in California, for example, 1 out of 3 foreclosures is a rental property. So the question is, who's losing those properties, and then who's buying them? And what has happened is rents have been extremely resilient through the foreclosure crisis. They haven't gone down that much. In fact, they've gone up. And but property values have gone down. So the average foreclosure decreases about 27% in value after foreclosure. So you're a landlord. It's a great opportunity because you can buy below market rent, below market value, and rent the property at or even a little bit above what market rent was a few years ago. So what I think is happening to the urban housing market is small landlords are the ones that are losing their properties. the ones that are able to put down very large down payments to buy them up, because we've had an insolvency crisis and lending institutions have become more stingy, are big landlords, are big real estate companies. So if that's the case, then it means property is becoming concentrated in fewer and fewer hands. And a plain, simple economic model would suggest that that's going to increase rents, and it's going to increase evictions. And so the long-term consequence of the foreclosure crisis could be one where once we think we're kind of out of the mess, once we think we're kind of, we've put that behind us, that very difficult lost decade. Who owns the city could have undergone a really substantial transformation that could make life harder for families that are already crunched by the high cost of housing.